All right. Hello, everyone. Happy Friday. So we're about to start. If you're here, please turn on your cameras. So see how many people we have. Cool, 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 cool. Okay, so let me share. Annie, where are you at?
I'm actually up at a retreat center that I'm working at.
Oh, okay, okay. Good, good. All right. Um, So yeah, um, so today we're going to introduce. We'll start talking about quantitative research. Like finally. Um, oops. Good. Okay. Okay. No problem. All right. So let me talk about quantitative research. So to remind you, the reason we do research supposedly is like we want to uncover things about reality. We want to understand how things happen in our surroundings, right? And so the point of doing research on in like in communication in particular, but in the sciences in general, is that the idea if we want to understand some aspects of human communication, there should be some agreed upon ways by which we can investigate those different topics, those different phenomenons, by which we could arrive to conclusions that are truthful about description of reality, which means we could would come up with specific recommendations or solutions for whatever problem that are involved or related to those things that we've investigated, right? And we started by by talking about, so we talked about content analysis, and then we talked about qualitative research, and we were doing like a lot of like exploration of different qualitative research questions that aim to understand like particular points of view from like any community of human actors, right? So whether we're speaking about street vendors in New York City, if we're speaking about users of machine washers, or we speaking about female college students who use Instagram, or kids who use tablets, or people who are hesitant to take vaccine. Those were examples of research trying to understand a particular point of view from from like a small community. But then there are many questions that we've asked, like questions you've asked, like when you give examples during class, when we had like discussion board, when you talk about certain limitations in the assignment you submitted. So some examples would be, for example, have the school closures because of COVID slowed down the mental development of young school kids? Okay, that's a research question. Does exposure to images of ideal body models increase depression among young females? That's the question. Is there a correlation between social media use and depression among teens? Right? Is political advertising on Facebook effective in making people more politically involved? Right? Does student attentiveness increase when they turn in their cameras on Zoom? That's also like a question like you might ask. Like depending on like if you're interested in like educational policy or pedagogy online, did the trust in vaccination increase with the level of education? And there are multiple problems when you try to answer these type of questions. So what do you mean by mental development, right? See, mental development of kids been affected. Why do you mean by mental development? Why do we mean by ideal body models, right? We discussed that a lot. I mean, we hear like ideal body models. So what does that mean? We just like who would say what's an ideal body model? What do you mean by depression? Okay, like who are young females? Right? Speaking of which, can someone tell me what do we mean by depression? Like if you hear the word depression, what comes to mind? Can someone give me their own definition of the word depression or what they associate with the word depression?
Maybe it could be like a diagnosed disorder.
A diagnosed disorder. That's interesting. What characterizes that diagnosed disorder? How would it be different than other diagnosed disorders that exist? What's unique about depression? So if you put that research question aside, if someone tells you such and such is depressed, what would that mean to you? What would come to mind?
I would say overwhelming sadness or lack of motivation.
Okay, so overwhelming sadness and lack of motivation. Why did you say overwhelming? Why the need for that qualifier?
Can you repeat that, please?
I mean, why did you say overwhelming sadness? Why overwhelming?
Sometimes our emotional state can kind of hinder our like normal functioning from our
Mm-hmm.
day-to-day practices.
Mm-hmm.
And so that overwhelmingness can be a means of navigating what would be considered normal.
I see. Okay. Okay. So you're saying it's not just sadness. It's sadness. It is sadness in a certain to a certain degree that overwhelms you, such that you would be incapable of executing normal functions of daily life. That's a good description. Okay. So yeah, that's one definition of depression according to Gianna. So it's an overwhelming sadness uh, that could overtake or affect or physically or like not sorry psychologically and emotionally hamper your daily routine or like a functioning uh, execution of duties like any day. Okay. Anyone else? Okay, when you hear the word depressed, what is it? What does it mean to you? Depression? Any other ideas? And also, Gianna said like a different word, which is sadness. Okay. So again, what does sad mean? What would you associate with sadness? Like in terms of expressions, state, what is sadness?
I'm not an expert on this. This is me just like totally like guessing and assuming.
Yeah, that's the point.
Yeah, okay. But sadness, in my opinion, is like um the absence of happiness, and when you're feeling down or like gloomy. I don't know. I can only use adjectives, I guess.
Okay. Like, can anyone think of like particular signs of sadness? Like what? So if you have a roommate and you started, like, what things would lead you to think that they are sad? Um, let's hear from some other people. So, let's see. So, uh, Emily, are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, we haven't heard from you in a while. So, what signs of sadness, like what signs would you associate with sadness?
I mean, physically, like frowning, crying, someone's like eyes watering. Also, like, I don't know, maybe like silence, like if they're not talking and they're
Mm-hmm,
just kind of sitting there.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. So, like, yeah, crying, isolation. Is there like, yeah, like a social isolation?
Yeah.
Yeah, lack of ability to express yourself. Yeah. So, so these are like, yeah, so these are different definitions, right? It could apply to other things. So let's look at the other examples, right? Now you see it saying like some signs of depression could be sleeping all the time, not eating, not hanging out with friends anymore. Yes, so these are particular signs of depression. When you hear a word like, when you say someone like is becoming politically involved, what would political involvement mean? What does political involvement mean to you?
Maybe taking part in activism or being part of an organization that wants to perpetuate certain ideals.
Yeah. So the example Lily gave was like, yes, it's a political involvement would mean taking part in an organization or some sort of an activism, right? Online, offline. So that, according to that definition, is what political involvement is. Any other example? Like, what is? How would you understand political involvement?
I mean, it could be voting or like participating in a campaign.
Yeah, that's right. So political involvement could be, you don't have to be involved with a political organization, but just the mere act of voting or like registering to vote and then going to vote is what would be considered with political involvement, right? And so you could see, so we hear like two different definitions. One is saying like like involvement means in terms of like political organizational engagement, and involvement could also mean just voting. Right? You can think the same way about student attentiveness. Like, so what is attentive, right? Is it like you're paying attention? Is it like you're participating in class? What is trust? Right? Like you, like, yeah, like it could be different definitions for us. And so there's different ways of like, different ways to define those terms, and different ways to measure them. Right? So you have a question about like, does exposure to images of ideal body models increase depression among young females? Well, how are you going to measure exposure to images on Instagram, and how are you defining depression or like body depression with females? That this conversation just had about those concepts is what we would call the conceptual definition and operational definition. Okay, so Gianna gave us one conceptual definition of depression, right? Like, so depression, if someone is coming from like a different, like who doesn't know what the word depression means, coming from a different linguistic background, and then Gianna or someone else would give them that definition, right? So an overwhelming sense of sadness that incapacitates the person from conducting daily activities and affect their mental and emotional state. That would be one what we call conceptual definition. Is like something that generally describe an idea, right, or a concept. And then others like Emily and Anais in the chat also were saying they're like specific signs to depression. So it could be like loss of sleep or sleeplessness, loss of appetite, loss of like interpersonal or social engagement, a sense of isolation, lack of motivation to go out and engage with others. Those are things are not conceptual definition of what depression is, but these are particular explanations or particular criteria for what are the signs by which we could assess this person is depressed, right? That is what we call operational definition. Okay, so in quantitative research, the idea is that you moving from conceptual definition, just i.e. generally or like overall talking about something, into providing specific criteria. And if you remember doing the content analysis activity, for those of you who took it, remember when we said, okay, you have coding, you want to code, and so you said some tweets would be promotional, some would be about like a community event, or like community, or like new product. And then we asked you to give us like criteria, like what specific things would make a tweet belong to the category promotional. So similarly, that's what we mean by operational definition. You give specific criteria of what would be considered a depressive state, what would be considered as political involvement. Is it just voting? Is it just getting involved with political news? Is it becoming involved with organizations? That's what we call operational definition. Right? So these are the concrete examples or criteria of what would make something fall under which concept. And then from that operational definition, we get into measurements, right? So once you define political involvement as voting, you can measure it as someone, did they vote or not? Right? So did they vote just in the general election? Did they vote general state? Do they vote in the state and local election? Did they vote for during midterm elections? Did they vote for like a school board? Right? So it's really like once you define it operationally as voting, then you could then precisely measure it. The question then you might ask is that, okay, how is this related to what we've been talking about? And so the idea we do this is because in empirical research, and we've mentioned this before, we talked about like standards or the pillars of empirical research. So we said they are objectivity, falsifiability, consistency, and validity. And so objectivity, to remind you, is like we said, like you separate like the opinions, the attitudes, or like point of view of the researcher from the topic they are investigating, right? And so in other words, when you're studying depression, there should be an agreed upon definition of depression such that we know that we're talking about the same thing when different researchers are investigating depression, right? So it cannot be, for instance, let's say we are investigating the effects of social media and depression. And so Emily could have one understanding of depression. I could have a different understanding of depression, and Zoe could have a a third understanding of depression. And all of us conduct our research, or each of us conduct their research, but we could be talking about totally three different things, right? So for someone, depression is just mere sadness. And someone else, depression means like clinical depression. And a third one is like something like an in-between state. It's not like clinical depression, but it's not just sadness. It's something like more severe than that, right? By objectivity is like when we arrive that, okay, this is what we mean by depression. And so when we talk about it, we know what we're talking about. Then with that objectivity would then give you two additional things. It's falsifiability and consistency. Could someone remind us what does falsifiability mean? We've explained this before. Was it the exam one? What does falsifiability mean?
It means it can like be tested and like possibly potentially proven invalid or valid.
Okay, yeah, can be tested and proven invalid or valid. Okay, so can someone think of an example? What can we prove to be invalid? We can go back to the questions, right? So look at these questions. No, sorry, not this one. Here, these questions, okay? Let me ask someone who's been talked in a while. Annie, are you still here?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Okay, pick one question of those.
Pick one of the questions.
Yeah.
Okay. Does the trust in vaccination increase with level of education?
Okay, my question to you is, can this question be tested?
Yeah, I think so.
How are we going to do that?
Like have two groups of participants, and the first would like read information on the vaccine and then rate their comfortability with it, and the other group wouldn't have any information on it and then would rate their comfortability.
Okay, this is a very interesting approach. So yeah, here and what do you mean by comfortability? What do you mean by that?
Like a scale of from like 1 to 5 on like highly or very uncomfortable to very comfortable.
Oh, okay. So here, like, it's thank you, Annie. So what Annie said, okay, Annie now defined level of education like level of informativeness or like being informed. So saying like exposure to facts about the vaccine would increase your comfort or level of comfort of taking it, right? And so what we hear like is because now we're talking about concrete things, we could actually test or like more concrete things, we can actually test the relationship between them. So in empirical research, when you talk about trust in the vaccine, it doesn't only mean like something that you would just say, I trust the vaccine, but like we need to have some sort of like a measurement to say, okay, are you comfortable taking it? That's what we mean by trust. And level of education could mean the level of education. So we could just do a survey and are you comfortable taking the vaccine? And then compare that to your own level of education, right? Or it could be being educated about a specific topic, right? So what Annie did was operationally define education as education about the vaccine in particular. Right? So that's what falsifiability is. So the reason we have objective definitions. Once you accept, for example, Annie's definition, then anyone could falsify those results, that hypothesis or that research question. And we would have a consistency in measurement, right? So it's not like, okay, I chatted with Lily for 10 minutes about the vaccine. I chatted with Ariana for 10 minutes, and I chatted with Emily about the vaccine. And then I just got a sense of what they feel about it. But I actually had a scale or a measurement that had like numerical values, and it was standardized across. Right? So Lily precisely gave an like exact number on the same scale that Ariana answered and Emily answered to, right? As opposed to just have a conversation about it. Right? So the consistency in measurement allow us for testability and allow us to compare individuals, one another, or even different studies to another. And finally, we said like empirical research is built on the validity and theories. That is to say that the measure we use actually apply to the concept we're studying, right? So your level of comfort with taking the vaccine. So if you had that scale of 1 to 7, are you comfortable, not comfortable with taking it? Is that actually testing trust? Okay. So answering a scale or like a question on a scale of 1 to 5, does that actually measure trust? Okay. What would be another way in measuring trusting the vaccine, though? How can we also measure trusting the vaccine?
Asking people if they plan to get one.
Yeah, yeah, right. So you can ask very simply, do you do you plan to take the vaccine, or not even plan? What could be more direct? So you either plan to do things.
Or if you've already gotten
Yeah,
it.
go ahead, sir. Yeah, right. So we could simply then, right? Yeah, we could say like trust in the vaccine is like if you already at least signed up or like took it, right? So this is like, so those are like different measurements, right? So it could be expressing likelihood or like comfort taking it, intention to take it, or actually taking it. Right? So that's what we mean by having, that's the measurement part in here, like how exactly you're going to measure it. Why are we talking about this, right? Because the thing is, in the natural sciences, so forget about the social sciences for a while now, for a few seconds. In the natural sciences, what they do is that they study tangible things, or they study physical phenomena, right? If you are a let's say a geologist or a meteorologist. Let's say you want to study the effects of heat waves on the Amazon's level of deforestation. There are very particular and objective and standardized ways of measuring heat waves, like temperature-wise, air pressure, humidity, you name it, right? Those are like tangible and observable things. And there are like very also like tangible ways to measure deforestation. So deforestation is you have less trees, and the less like green like plants you have per square meter, the more deforestation you have, right? So the construct they're studying are directly measured and very precisely defined most of the time, not all of the time. Okay, but in the natural sciences, most of the things they study are like tangible. However, in the social science, it's a different story, right? Because we measure attitudinal and behavioral variables that don't necessarily have a tangible or a physical presence. So, in other words, you cannot find depression. Okay, you can talk about depression, you can feel depression, you can understand it, but there's no place in which you could see depression or touch depression or like measure depression, physically speaking. And you can talk about involvement, motivation, excitement, love, hate, enthusiasm, etc. But all of these concepts are not tangible. Those are things that we as human beings came up with to describe an array of emotions and states and thoughts we have, but we cannot really put our like put our fingers at, or like put our hands on. And so because of that, we, especially in the social sciences more than the natural sciences, or like, is that we want a way of then to more objectively define those things, so we can also be able to measure them, test them, and falsify them in an objective way, right? So those are things by nature that are not tangible and not objective, but we try through that process that we showed, from moving from an agreed upon conceptual definition to an operational definition to standardized measurement, in order for all of us to look at those intangible variables and be able to test them. And testability is that like, what would that entail? Like, why we need them? So remember, in qualitative research, we say that the purpose is to explore different concepts or identify research agenda. So you're exploring, for example, the opinions of college students about their Instagram use. Okay, you're exploring like how like different sports, for instance, affect the motivation or affect the mental state of different college athletes, right? Um, but in quantitative research, the idea is not exploratory, but it's mostly explanatory and predictive. That is to say, we want to test the relationship between two variables in a hypothesis precisely. Okay, so the variables, as we've mentioned before, you would have independent variables and you have dependent variables, right? And the independent variables are your predictors, your dependent variables are your outcomes, right? So in empirical research, there must be like a very precise way to show the relationship between the predictor and the outcome. So when you say Instagram use or social media use leads to more depression, there has to be a standardized numerical way to measure social media use and a standardized numerical way to measure depression, and then show how a way to show the relationship between the two, right? So that's the idea of like coming up with operational definitions or measurement, right? Also to remind you, and like if you remember what is a variable, so a variable is any concept that could vary, right, and measured in any way. So depression is a variable, political involvement is a variable, age is a variable, level of education is a variable, gender is a variable, etc. In qualitative research, variables could be measured based on impressions and subjective interpretation, and that's what we showed, for instance. So you could go and talk to a group of like school children about how they use like their tablets and what level of attachment do they feel about their tablets, and you would only be interested in hearing different perspectives, right? And getting a general sense of what are like the commonalities between those school children, and what themes or what common threads that could identify those relationship with the tablets, right? Whereas in quantitative research, those variables could be need to be measured numerically, right? And so, for instance, I'll give you an example. How would you measure addiction to tablets or addiction to technological devices? How would you measure that? Can someone make a wild guess? Let's look at. Okay, so Emily saying hours of use, screen time. Right. Okay. So if someone is saying, okay, that they're becoming too dependent or problematically dependent on their tablets, why would you say it's problematic? What signs, for instance, would lead you to think that one kid is addicted to their tablet? Can you think of any, let's say, observable behavior or observable state?
Maybe that it's getting in the way of them doing other like productive things, like if they have homework or if they want to, they would rather hang out with friends, but they would rather be on their tablet instead.
Yeah, that's correct. So yeah, nice saying. Okay, so we would then take that as a way to measure problematic dependence on tablets, right? So in a way, so if we're taking, for example, if we run an experiment and we took the tablets from the children, if that even prevented them from the ability to initiate like social relationship or communicating with friends or like siblings or relatives, we would call that signs of addiction, right? So the idea is always in quantitative research, like you need to be able to measure those things numerically, okay? So yeah, like how many, let's say, how many hours of agitations, or how many, let's say, for instance, how many social or how many situations in which they were not able to communicate, right? So things like that. So that's what we mean by arriving into like quantitative research, why we need numerical measurement. So I'm sort of, so this is sort of repetitive, but it's sort of a review. So the conceptual definition, to remind you, is just an abstract or theoretical meaning of your variable, i.e. how would you describe it? An operational definition is like a way to collect and measure the variable, right? So is it by hours of use? Is it by specific symptoms that you could quantify? Those type of things, right? Like we talk about different variables. Okay, and here's another example that I would give, and this would be it. Like there's one concept, I study advertising, so brand liking is one concept I encounter. So brand liking is conceptually defined as the assessment of appeal a customer has for a brand. Okay, appeal of a brand. Operational definition would be several items such as, I feel attached to the brand. Overall, I approve of the brand. Like that, I like the brand products, etc., etc. So questions along those lines. And that operational definition in the quantitative research would be equal to the concepts you're studying. All right. So that's what we mean by testable and standard. So your answers to these items would constitute what we would define as brand liking. Okay. Regardless of how you feel those items themselves are truly reflective of the concept they claim to measure. That's a discussion for another class, literally. But that's what we like. In items or measurements would then be, when you talk about brand liking, we'll be talking to like how the participant answered those questions. Okay, so that's um, so yeah, it's also like conceptualization. It's like about just written definitions. Operationalization would always in quantitative research have standardized and numerical scales, and we're going to look at different examples of them. So that's it for today. I'm also going to post a very short video. Like this one is like going to be like a 10-minute video about also they would be, so it's sort of like an interactive exercise about operational and conceptual definitions. Aside from that, remember there's a quiz on Friday, and the review guide has already been uploaded. Do you have questions about the quiz though? Since I'm here.
I just have a question about the short video you just mentioned. So when will you be uploading that, and when should we have it watched by?
Today, you're going to upload it today.
Okay.
And
gotcha.
you haven't till Friday. Yes, Bridget.
When does the quiz open? Is it open at 9?
I'll try to make it. I'll make it open earlier, so like around 7 a.m. So up until like 11, from 7 to 11 a.m.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, if that way, I think if that works. Any other questions about the quiz? Okay, cool. Yeah. So okay, obviously there's no class on Friday, so I'll see you after spring break. Hopefully, enjoy your spring break safely, and I wish you the best. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.